Good morning, students. Today I, Padmaja Behera, has come with another chapter from the book Snapshots, and the name of the chapter is The Address. Let's proceed and know more about the story. The Address is written by Margot Minko during the World War II when Germany invaded Holland. A woman with her daughter had to flee from her home, and as a result, the mother dies because of the war. Long after the war, the daughter comes back to her town. She meets the woman with whom her mother had left all her belongings. The woman even refuses to recognize her. She could make out that the lady has no intention of returning the things she has in her possession. The narrator gives up the idea of getting them back again, so she decides to leave all of them behind. At that very moment, she resolves to forget the address where those belongings were lying in unpleasant surroundings. Now, children, let's proceed to the main points. The narrator is Mrs. S.'s daughter, who visits 46 Marconi Street and sees the daughter of Mrs. S. After reaching at the address, she presses the bell. The woman with a broad back opened the door. She looked at the newcomer searchingly, and she was Mrs. Darling. The narrator, that is Mrs. S.'s daughter, introduced herself. The woman's face showed absolutely no sign of recognition, and she kept staring at her in silence. The girl, that is the narrator, Mrs. S.'s daughter, had once seen the woman years ago, and that too fleetingly. She realized that perhaps she had rang the wrong bell, but soon her doubt was set to rest, because the narrator saw Mrs. Darling wearing her mother's green knitted cardigan. She could make out that it was her mother's cardigan, and it had wooden buttons that justified that she was at the right place. Children, let's move on to the next slide and have a look. Mrs. Darling, that is the owner, that is the lady who stayed at 46 Marconi Street, does not recognize the narrator. The girl asked the woman if she still knew her. Mrs. Darling replied that she did not. She stood there dumbfounded. Why? She could never think that the narrator had come back. The narrator then told her that she was the daughter of Mrs. S. The woman asked, "Have you come back?" It was clear that she was not pleased to see the girl again. She had a feeling that both the mother and the daughter must have passed away. The girl replied that she was the only one who had survived and has come back to his town to claim her mother's belongings. The woman expressed regret that she could do nothing for her. The narrator told her that she had come specially for her by train, and she wanted to talk to her for a moment. But the lady, that is Mrs. Darling, showed her helplessness. She was not ready to entertain the girl, and she asked her if she could come some other time. Children, This is the after effects of war. War always brings destruction. War always takes away from our near and dear ones. Look at the present situation, the COVID-19 situation, how we are left, how we have lost many of our near and dear ones. Now, the narrator is in a very painful state. She thinks of her mother and she gets lost in old memories. She thought about her mother, who had given her the address of Mrs. Darling years ago. And the place where they were staying, that is Holland, was war-stricken. It had been in the first half of the war. She remembered how she came home for a few days. She noticed that various things in the house were missing because the narrator was not staying with her mother. Her mother then told her about Mrs. Darling, who stayed at 46 Marconi Street. The daughter had never heard of her before. Then her mother told that she is an old acquaintance and both of them have revived the relationship. Now, Mrs. Darling must have been an old acquaintance and she started coming regularly to the house of Mrs. S. As you know, children, the narrator is Mrs. S.'s daughter. Now, after they develop friendship, Mrs. Darling visits them frequently. Mrs. Darling visited them, the narrator's mother, and whenever she visited, she took something with her. One day, she took all the silverware, and then she took away all the antique plates that hung on the wall. Mrs. S. told her daughter that Mrs. Darling wanted to save all the articles, as it was wartime, and if they had to leave the place, they would lose everything. The daughter wanted to know if there was a written agreement that Mrs. Darling would return all the articles safely. Because the girl, as you know, could never trust anyone blindly. But the mothers, they're very simple. But the girl seemed to be quite matured. That is why she says that some agreement should have been signed. Otherwise, any of us can refuse that those articles do not belong to them rather than theirs. Mrs. S. replied that it was not necessary. Rather, she was thankful to Mrs. Darling for what she was doing for her at that point of time when the war was going on. And it happened years and years ago. Now, let's move on to the next slide. The narrator is very much disturbed because she had come with a purpose in mind. When her first visit to Mrs. Darling went vain, she decided to visit again. The narrator's first visit was not rewarding. This time, she found her 15-year-old daughter in the house. But Mrs. Darling was not there. As she had reached the proper address, the address which she had remembered such a long time, she decided to wait for Mrs. Darling. Got it, children? Because when there is a purpose in your mind, you decide to fulfill that purpose. Now, let's have a look at what all the narrator saw when she went inside the house of Mrs. Darling. The narrator found herself in the midst of things which all belonged to her mother. She wanted to see them, touch them, because those were all her mother's belongings. The mother was no longer alive, but she wanted to feel the presence of her mother in those things. And all those costly articles were taken away by Mrs. Darling and kept here in her house. She was very depressed and sad and pained to see that they were arranged tastelessly, unlike her mother, who was a sophisticated person who must have kept all those things in the dedicated places. The ugly furniture and the muggy smell upset her, because the girl belonged to a very good family, Mrs. S. daughter. She had never seen herself in those kind of surroundings. Mrs. Darling's daughter brought tea for her. Then she opened a box and took some spoons out of it. All those spoons were also of her mother. The teacup from which she was having tea also belonged to her mother. The daughter had fond memories of her mother. The narrator even looked at the antique plates. She knew all the cutlery knives, fork, spoons were of silver. Her mother had told her about them when she was alive. Just understand the mental state of Mrs. S.'s daughter, who sees all her mother's belongings, lying scattered haywire inside the house. They were so tastelessly kept, and seeing that, she felt very sad and depressed. Now, before concluding the story, let's understand the theme. Every chapter has a particular theme. The story deals with the after effects of war. Children, we all know that war brings destruction. Secondly, as I told you in the very beginning, it is always better to move on in life rather than go on lingering in the past. If the past brings painful memories, it is better to look forward in life. Children, you or me, for that matter, we always move forward, just like the river. It always moves forward, never backward. Children, this is a nice thought, that if our past brings forth painful memories, it is always better to look forward in life, so that you look for a positive opening. I hope all of you loved watching this presentation, same as I loved it, but I would appreciate that please go through the chapters, and as I teach in the class, please read thoroughly, because unless and until you read the chapter thoroughly, you will never be able to understand. If a question is asked or a MCQ is asked, you will never be able to answer all of them. So it is always better to go through the chapter thoroughly. Children, I have attached a PDF file also, wherein all the questions along with the summary has been given. Please go through them, and whatever doubts you have, you can very well clear them. If any doubt, please feel free to discuss. I hope the chapter is clear for you. Thank you, children.